Okay, I'm sorry about that. I've had some technical problems. I think I forgot to reboot my computer before we started. I'm working off my laptop now, and so everything froze up, and I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was being heard or whatever. So we lost about 10 minutes of me talking, which is horrible. We don't want to lose 10 minutes of me talking. Anyway, my name is Chuck Horton. I'm your host tonight on Double Cross Radio, coming to you live from the Republic of Jefferson. And the Republic of Jefferson, as far as we're concerned, the Republic of Jefferson is anywhere where there are people that love liberty. And Jefferson was a champion of liberty. Last week on the show, I was talking about the Federal Reserve and how their debasement of the money has kind of caused a lot of the problems we're experiencing in our society today. And I didn't want to just make it a pile on the Federal Reserve, but I mean, they really are a horrible institution. I don't know how anybody can think that you live in a free market society when you have a banking monopoly that's run by a out-of-country cartel. Yeah, the majority of the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are out-of-country banks, European central banks. So it's not even nothing you can do about it, people. It was done in 1913. It was kind of too late now. Possibly you could have done something if you had elected Ron Paul, but that didn't happen. So anyway, last week's program, even though the Federal Reserve, when they make their money maneuvers, they don't make direct effects that change our lives for the worse. The things that they do that have direct effect on us end up affecting us negatively, and that it's all kind of linked to how they destroy the value of the money. And money is one of the ways we measure how much something is worth, and it kind of carries on over into other things that we subjectively value, and it can even go into personal relationships and things like this. We just don't have a way to base anything, or our money, for better or for worse, is something that we can use as a kind of a rock that we anchor everything on, and we can compare the value of one thing to another in terms of something else. But when that something else is continually changing its value, that makes it really difficult. And so we examine even that. Now, I'm going to continue my examination of the banking industry in America tonight. And some of the information I'm going to tell you, it may make you mad. Please don't be mad at me, because I'm just the messenger. And it may make you feel kind of sick to your stomach. Well, that's exactly how it made me feel when I first discovered this. But whatever you do, I don't want you to blame me for telling you the truth. It's the information that I'm going to give you is information that you need to hear. And it's really not something that you can understand fully if you don't. I can't explain it to you without you. Well, in the time remaining, I would need maybe several hours to go through this. But you really owe it yourself to start doing some of this research on your own, because your life could depend on this information. Now, last week, as I said, I was talking about the banking industry, and this week I was kind of wondering what I was going to talk about, and I was reading something in the morning before I came to work. I was reading something that was written by Simon Black at the Sovereign Man website. This was from his, I think it was May 4th thing. What was the title on this one? It started out, Notes from the Fields. This was the first three sentences. It was another time, another era, another superpower. So if you get a hold of that and you read it, it's really a great piece. And I read it, and then I came to work and I started doing my stuff. And one of the things I do every day is I make the deposit up and go to the bank. Well, my business is one of those businesses that makes cash deposits every day. As many of our transactions are cash transactions. By the way, in case you don't remember, my business is a liquor store. And a lot of the people who frequent the store would rather have their purchases kind of be anonymous. So they prefer cash. Anyway, I'm standing there and I have my deposit, and it's a lot of cash. And ahead of me, there's a man who'd been sent by his boss to make a cash withdrawal from this branch. And I could not help but overhear the teller explain to him that that particular branch did not have that much cash on hand. And I was trying not to eavesdrop, but I was also just saying, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I didn't know how much the guy was asking for, but they don't have enough cash." Well, it turns out he was asking for a little over $4,000 there. His boss had sent him. They were going to make a cash purchase later that day, and I don't know exactly what his business was or what they were doing, what they were buying. It didn't matter to me. What was amazing was that the bank didn't have money for him to pick up. They didn't have, at this, I guess, $4,000. Now, I happen to have almost that much in my bank bag, and I wanted to shout, "Oh, I could make my deposit, then you could give him some of this." But I didn't. I just said, "This isn't my business. I don't want to get involved." And I'd already overheard more than I probably should have. So, anyway, having spent the last two programs, and if I don't like to brag about myself, but I'm really one of my friends, Eric Dubin, called me on Sunday after listening to last week's program, and he says he was just overwhelmed. He says that was really a good show, Chuck. You really hit a home run on that one. So I guess if Eric thought it was pretty good, then maybe it's worth listening to. If some of the rest of you missed that, maybe you should check it out. I don't know. I don't want to brag about myself, but I was happy with it and listening to it the second time that I made the points I wanted to make. And anyway, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, I just finished reading this great article by Simon Black, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, the bank didn't have enough money? Now, some of you have been listeners from the very beginning, and you might recognize some of the information that's coming next, but it doesn't, just the fact that we've said it before doesn't mean it's changed or it isn't true. It's still true today, and it's something that if you've forgotten, maybe you should hear it, or if you're a new listener, you should understand this. When you deposit money in your account at a bank, it is no longer your property. When they give you a deposit receipt, that deposit receipt is a promise to pay the amount that repay the amount that you've given them. They're going to promise to give you back the money, and then when you take it into your possession, then it becomes yours again. Now, that's all good. I mean, the banks that would renege on that promise would quickly go out of business. So as long as they are able to honor your request, they do. But theoretically, having this promise to pay the amount that you've deposited back to you doesn't mean that they're going to always be able to. If the bank happens to have loaned out more money than it has in reserve, when people come in and demand a percentage of their money back, or maybe all of it, we have what's called a run on the bank, and they're not able to give you the money. In this case, the bank was a branch of a bank that has several branches around town, and they were able to send the man to the main branch where he was able to pick up the money, I guess. I assume. I didn't follow him to see if he was successful, but I assume he was, because they had called and they were getting it ready for him before he got there. And I wasn't really trying to overhear all this. They were just kind of talking back and forth in loud enough voices. It was hard not to overhear it. But it made me think about this, just how safe is your deposit? Well, that kind of depends on the bank. Some banks are pretty sound and some of them are pretty sick. Even in a good economy, banks fail. You have to recognize that. And that's one of the things that it's really important that you check out before you open an account at a bank. And I know you're going to ask this, when I say how safe is your deposit, you're saying, well, it's insured by the FDIC. Well, here's some interesting facts about the FDIC. Presently, the FDIC has $25 billion in reserve should your bank fail. Now, if one bank in the country fails, no, don't worry, they've got it covered. Two banks, they probably still have it covered unless it's a really huge bank. But if the total number of banks exceeds a certain number, they do not have enough money. Now, taking into account the total deposits that are on deposit, now the total deposits are in excess of $9 trillion. They also have exposures to derivatives, which exceed over $300 trillion. Excuse me, 200, just under $300 trillion. The total between the two is pretty close to $310 trillion. So if they have $25 billion in reserve and they're trying to insure $310 trillion in deposits and exposures that are they're from toxic derivatives, it would appear to me that they are horribly underinsured. That they do not have enough reserve funds to take care of a banking failure. So if the banking system kind of goes belly up, you're probably going to be standing in line to maybe get 9 cents on the dollar if you're lucky. I say maybe because I am sure that as crooked as some of these big players are, that they're going to make sure they get theirs out before you can get yours out. And their haircut's not going to be as bad as yours. So they might get 25 cents on the dollar. You might get 2 cents on the dollar. And that's just kind of how it is. You think, well, they can't do that. That's wrong. Well, there's a lot of things they do in this country that they shouldn't be able to do that are wrong, and they still do them. So just don't be thinking that we're being run by a bunch of angels that never could do anything immoral anymore, because we aren't. Our country's been run by a bunch of crooks and criminals. By the way, leading into the show, I was listening to Hal Anthony. He did an awesome job tonight. Just, Hal, keep doing what you're doing. That was great stuff. I loved it. Now, to make matters worse, and you say, how could it be worse than this? You say my bank might be sick, and there's really not enough reserves to handle a nationwide banking run. Well, it could be a lot worse, actually. The years and years of continued quantitative easing, which was first used to rid banks of their toxic assets, and then allowed the banks to replace these assets with bonds so they would have reserves, have created a situation where interest rates cannot be raised without a complete bond market collapse. And if that were to happen, because of the way the banks have used bonds as their reserve, now that they've gotten rid of their toxic assets, because the real estate they held was toxic, and so the Federal Reserve has purchased a lot of those toxic assets, and they're trying to get rid of all that stuff off their books. They're trying to make it look better than it is. They're kind of a zombie central bank by holding them at the value the loan was placed at, or some of them are worth far less than that, never were even close to that value. They aren't even income property. They can't even cut their losses. Might as well just write it off and hope it burns down. Maybe you get an insurance settlement. And don't think they haven't thought of that, except they'd probably get caught, so they don't want to do that. But I want you to know that the whole banking system has been painted into a corner by themselves, by the Federal Reserve. Every bank that's in this country is regulated by the Federal Reserve, and that's not the federal government. The Federal Reserve is a private institution, and they have a monopoly on banking. They have a monopoly on the creation of money. And money is, as we said last week, is 1/2 of every transaction. So it's pretty important. And because the first spender of every dollar gets maximum, every counterfeited dollar, or every dollar that's created out of thin air, the first spender gets maximum benefit. And every succeeding transaction, that debasement comes into play, and the purchasing power of that dollar diminishes over and over and over again. And that was one of the reasons why they had the banks purchase these T-bills or treasury bonds to make the banks whole, to make them seem like they were not sick, they weren't dead, give them kind of a zombie appearance, is that would be a reserve against the deposits that were being made into the bank, so that those are just as good as cash, kind of, almost, except now there's no way they can raise interest rates. And I mean, no way, because a 1 or 2% increase in interest rates will kill the bond market. It will make all those bonds that are reserved for those banks worthless. There's nothing they can do. They cannot raise interest rates. If they stop printing money, the economy is going to go into full collapse. And so they're just going to keep printing money until we are in hyperinflation. That's just what's going to happen. And it might take a while because there's other world events that could make it happen tomorrow. But it could take a year or two. But it's going to happen. There's nothing they can do about this. They no longer have choices. They've made all their choices, and now it's time to face the consequences. You, however, because you're listening to this program, you have some things that you can do to lessen your demise when this happens. There's some other things you can do. And I wanted to let you know this isn't going to be the end of the world. It may seem like it for a few months. I want to talk about this article I read, and I already kind of gave you some information on it earlier. This was real. Simon Black, he's a graduate of West Point. I think it was West Point. He's knows a lot about history. He's very sound in economics. And I'm going to bring this up because this essay I had written, that I'd read, that he wrote, was kind of based on history and sound economics. And it was very interesting to me. And then just an hour or two after I had finished reading it, here I am at the bank and seeing this happen right before my very eyes. It's just exactly what he was talking about. So he starts the essay by going back in time to 1873. And Great Britain at that time was without a doubt the largest economy in the world, more or less like the United States is today. The pound enjoyed just about the same status that the U.S. dollar now enjoys. And I put a question mark after it enjoys in my notes because I don't know if it's, knowing that this is kind of going to be the end of our nation as we know it. It may not be something we're enjoying really. But I mean by that it's the primary trade exchange currency in the world, which gives the country whose currency it is a tremendous advantage. And we have abused our advantage, and that's why we're in the trouble we're in right now. According to Simon Black, there was more money in London than in just about every other financial center in the world combined. I was thinking about that for a second. I didn't say every country, I said every financial center. That means all the different central banks. The London Central Bank they were the kingpins. And Simon picked the year 1873 because it was in this year that Walter, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but I think it's Bagehot, published a book that pulled back the curtain on the phony prosperity that had been created by the Bank of London. Here's a quote from the book. "There is no country at present, and there was never any country before, in which the ratio of cash reserve to bank deposit was so small as it is now in England. The amount of cash is so exceedingly small that a bystander almost trembles when he compares its minuteness with the immensity of the credit which rests upon it." So think about that for a second, too. Here they are, they have cash reserves which are so small that somebody who witnesses this is just shocked. It makes them kind of sick to their stomach. They go, oh my God. And their cash reserves were not horrible according to our standards. They were between 10 and 15% of their deposits were held in reserve. Today, some banks hold as little as 3% of their deposits in reserve. That means if they had $1 million in reserve, they would have 30,000 in reserve. So if they had 1,000 people that had deposited $1,000 to get that $1 million, and as little as, I would say, as little as, let's say 30 people out of those 1,000 wanted to get their money out of the bank would fold. So this is this is how bad it has become here. Is that 3% of the depositors could cause, if they had enough assets that had been deposited at the bank, could cause a collapse of the bank. I have a question for you. With everything that I've told you up to now, suppose the banking system began to collapse and the government officials panicked, as they are wont to do because they are just absolute morons, and they decided to have a banking holiday. What would you do if your bank was closed for a week, a month, or possibly even longer than that? Just what would you do? How much do you depend on being able to access your money in the bank to do the things you do on a daily basis? I mean, do you use your ATM at the grocery store? Oh, wait a minute, those aren't going to work anymore because the bank's closed. So the card machines are not going to be usable. Do any of you remember a time, I think it was summer of 2014, maybe in August, July or August, when the card machines in I think it was in Alabama somewhere, Mississippi or Alabama, the card machines stopped working and people couldn't access their funds. And I think it was at a Walmart, so it might have just been localized to Walmart, and it was just pandemonium. It took less than 2 hours for just complete chaos. People were shouting. They were thinking that they were being denied access to stuff because of their color of their skin or whatever. And then other people thought, well, I'm just going to take this stuff and because I need this, and you're not going to take my money, so I'm just going to take it. And there weren't enough security people there, and there were people taking out just huge baskets full of food and TV sets or whatever, almost like a looting. And finally, the card machines came back online, and an order was restored. That people could actually, they were willing to pay for stuff. They just weren't being. They didn't have cash. They only could use the money that was at the bank that they could use their ATM cards, which the bank is happy to do because they make a percentage on those transactions. So that's going to be one of the last things that close down. But it happened, and it could happen. If the banks don't have the money, they don't have the money. So just know that things are going to be pretty chaotic pretty quickly. But if you cannot access your money, it's in the bank, what are you going to use to buy food? What are you going to use to pay the electric bill? I'm not going to ask you what you can do to pay your cell phone bill because, your cell phones probably aren't going to be working. Cell phone companies probably are out of business too. But what are you going to do to pay the bills that you have, your car payment? How are you going to, you have the money in the bank, but it's not yours really, it's the bank's. They only have promised to pay you, and as I said earlier, if they can't, they can't. Now, I don't want you to think that this couldn't happen in America, that this is America, that we are the greatest country on earth, that all have come before us so just are tremble down and bow at our feet because we're so awesome. That's just not the truth. The truth is it's already happened in this country once. Those of you who didn't fall asleep in history class when you were going to high school, you may even have been fortunate enough to have been instructed about during the Great Depression, they had a banking holiday, and it lasted over a week, in which they restructured a lot of banks, kind of made them whole. They weren't really whole, but they kind of zombified them, and they limped through the next, about the next 11 to 12 years until the economy finally recovered. But, and that was America's Great Depression, although I think we're in going to be a much worse depression right now, and have been for 7 years. And I don't want you to think that just people aren't talking about it or thinking about it, because when Barack Obama was elected president, that's one of the first things they considered in coming in. They're having conferences in the White House with their economic advisors and all other people concerned. Is they were really concerned about whether they needed to have a bank holiday because the banks were in such bad shape. And you've heard um, Joe Biden, the mouth that roared, talking about. He was talking about the former governor of New Jersey, and I should have written this guy's name down because I always forget people's names, but I think you guys know who I'm talking about. And he's the guy that really should have been in prison for stealing a bunch of people's money because his company that he had that was investing money took huge losses on the toxic assets, and among other people, Gerald Celenti's money was taken briefly, and it was eventually restored to him, but not by the company that went under. It was by the insurance company that insured them. And anyway, so that was considered, and Joe Biden was saying they had conference about it, and they decided not to because they thought that things would work out. They didn't say why they would work out or what reason they had to believe that, but they're just kind of optimistic, I guess. They think that being optimistic counts for a lot. That if you think about this is going to work out, then it'll somehow work out. I tend to have a little doubt about that, but that seemed to be what they were thinking about. And then there's been some smaller countries since this worldwide recession started, which is really a worldwide depression. Iceland and Cyprus, they had massive bank failures, and even though those are smaller population bases, their banks were closed for a week to 2 weeks. In Cyprus, I think it went past 2 weeks. I think it was close to 3. I didn't have time to research all this today. I wanted to make sure I got this other information to you. So I ask you again, what would you do to pay the electric bill? How would you buy food to feed your family? How would you pay your credit cards? How would you make your car payment? What if someone showed up to repossess your car because you hadn't made the payment? How are you going to get paid? Are you going to take a check when you can't go to the bank and cash it? I mean, are you going to let someone pay you with a check? You're going to demand cash. Have you thought about any of this stuff? Have you tried to think like how much do I depend on a healthy banking system? And if our banking system isn't healthy, why am I not scared shitless? Because your life is going to be miserable, and it may be the end of your life. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But we really need to fix this problem, and we're not even talking about it yet. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and close your account. It's not that I'm not gonna say not that important. It's not the right action to take because you still need those banks. You need to have a payment record for things that you do. You have. That's really an important feature of banks is that when you make a mortgage payment, there's a canceled check and you have a record of your payment. When you make a car payment. But you don't need it for everything you do. You don't need the bank when you go to the grocery store. You can pay them with cash. You don't need the bank when you go to buy presents for someone's birthday. You can pay with cash. And so maybe you should take some of your money and not keep so much of your money in the bank. You should keep some money out of the bank. And only use the banks for the monies where it really makes sense to use the bank and not for anything else. You don't need the bank. You don't need the bank for grocery money. You don't need the bank for going out on Friday night. You don't need the bank for those things. You can put money in a safe place in your home and budget it yourself, and you can take care of yourself. You don't need to use the bank for everything. And so you should do that. You should have some money that you keep in case we have this kind of emergency. Because this is entirely a possible event. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It means it could happen. That's what we're saying. And I personally believe it probably will, but I'd be very happy to be wrong about this. Okay, now, I'm going to reiterate again on this. I'm not telling you to go close your account. Not all banks are zombie banks. But how healthy is your bank? Do you know what their what their percentage of deposited money held in reserve is? Is it 3%, 5%, 10%, 20% would be really good. That would make me feel a lot more comfortable. It would take a lot more people wanting to get their money out before they started to fold their tent. But it doesn't mean they're immune if a bunch of zombie banks start to fail ahead of them and people start to panic. That's what they used to call depressions, panics, because the banking system is inherently flawed. The fractional reserve banking doesn't work. So during our, and I also want you to know that, in my opinion, it would be a good idea to have enough cash to live on for a month or two. And that may not be possible for everybody out there listening. You just, a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck these days. And while I don't, you should try and reduce your expenditures, try and do without some things you really don't need. I mean, do we really need a satellite TV with 200 stations on it and, movie channels and $150 bill? Do we really need a cell phone bill that, it's costing us $100 a month? Do we really need, there's a lot of things we could ask that question of. If we're living paycheck to paycheck, it's time you start to funnel some of your money into a savings account that you just don't touch. And by a savings account, I don't mean in a bank. I mean like in a place you might buy a safe and install it in your house and just put some money in there every payday. Put 10% of what you make in there and never take anything out until you have reached a goal of having a couple months cash on supply on hand. I mean, that's just to me would be a really prudent measure. Now, some of you guys are out there saying, "Oh, not me. I'm going to do gold and silver." Well, I don't think gold and silver are a bad thing to do. I own gold and silver myself, but I don't want you to believe that that's I'll use a couple of I won't use them. I was going to say think it's your golden parachute or your silver bullet. Those gold and silver was confiscated during our Great Depression. Gold mainly. I don't think the silver so much. The silver wasn't worth that much at that time. But the federal government made it illegal for people to own gold. And they confiscated it all at $20 an ounce. They gave them $20 in paper fiat money for every ounce that they collected. And after they had finished the collection process, in a day's time, they suddenly reevaluated it at $35 an ounce. So there was just a whopping 75% debasement of the currency in one day. So all those people that had given up their gold for $20, their purchasing power was reduced by about 37%. That's criminal. So don't think that gold and silver are going to see you through this time, because it may be because of laws that have been passed that no one is willing to trade with you with gold and silver because they're afraid that they won't be able to use it to get the things that they need. They will recognize the value of it possibly, but they may not see that it's going to do them any good because you're supposed to have turned it in. So don't think that that's the only safe route out, because that may not last. And I also want to say that my broadcast partner who is on a long sabbatical possibly won't ever come back. I don't know. I saw him this week. He's doing great. He had a big smile on his face. I think that not having to deal with the show is taking a lot of pressure off him. And if he continues to look so happy and whatever, I may follow him, because he looked awesome, and we had a great few minutes to talk before I had to get back to work. But anyway, Drew, he has used the first 7 years of this depression that we're currently in to master the field of aquaponics, and he's talked about it quite a few times on the show. And he did this because he felt that food production is going to be a valuable business to be involved in the coming years. When people can't buy food that they need, they're going to have to grow their own somehow. And because of the way they've restricted land use and They put people in. Gosh, there's a guy on Alex Jones' show this morning. He started showing people how they can grow food on rooftops and along along the streets on the grass. He's dug up some flower beds in the parks and planted tomato plants and things like this. And they have fruit-bearing trees they've planted. They're going to have food available from that. They're trying to lower people's cost of obtaining food. And he's been arrested for doing that. Meanwhile, Lois Lerner is still free. He has not been convicted or even indicted for obvious crimes. And same can be said for Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Harry Reid, and of course our Attorney General Eric Holder. So, back to my point that if you're going to succeed and survive during a tough few years, and it could be that long before, when things collapse, they'll get pretty tough pretty quickly, but they'll start to improve after that. And it may be a year or two before we get pulled out of it enough that things tend to return back to what we consider normal. That's kind of what happened in the Great Depression, and history tends to repeat itself. I have no doubt that it may do that again. I want you to know that it's really going to be important to have some kind of trade or skill that will enable you to get more for your labor than just the guy out there digging ditches or filling sandbags or whatever they're going to do to earn a buck so they can go down and buy a bag of apples to share with their family. It's going to be tough, and you're going to have to kind of scratch for meals for a while. I mean, my dad grew up in the Great Depression, and they lived on they lived on meager means. I mean, they would take $1 and go into Kansas City, buy 100 papers, come back and sell them for a slight profit, and have $1 left over for the next Sunday, and they'd have $1 which they could go and buy 100 chicks, usually which 95 to 97 of them would live, and they would grow those chicks up and harvest, and they ate a lot of chicken. And they would have eggs and chicken, and every once in a while he and his brothers would go down and catch frogs. They'd have frog legs once in a while. And that's kind of what they ate. And they had a garden. They grew their own food. And I'm thinking, man, how many people would be able to do this today? And I want you guys to all think about that too. Would you be able to feed yourself? Would you be able to figure out a way to put food on the table every night so that you could have enough energy to go to work the next day? That's something to consider. Now, I don't really have enough time to finish up the next part of that, the banking story, but I want you to know that the things that you need to do, and it's just, actually I'm going to sum up some points, and then I'm going to tell you what I think you really need to go and check out your bank's health. But I want you to know there's an unsustainable amount of debt in the system. And when we say unsustainable, it is sinking the ship. The banking system is dangerously illiquid and over-leveraged. Another way of saying that is it's a zombie. It's already dead. They're just going through the motions. They look like they're alive, but they're not. The banks are still engaged in the same risky behavior 7 years after the banking crisis, 2007, 2008. The central bank has far too much control over the economy. Remember, money is 1/2 of every transaction. And yet, the central bank is run by amateurs. Janet Yellen is a college professor. And she might have a really high IQ and everything, but she's never run a bank. Excuse me. She doesn't have the real life experience. And the banking system in itself is at risk of failing. And so you need to go and find out for yourself what the health of your bank is, because that is very, very important. Excuse me for a second. I need to clear my throat a little bit. Now, next point. We posted several stories. These are actually YouTube videos on our Facebook page today, and I want to talk about this because this is kind of related to this. There was a man in, let's see, his name was Lyndon McClellan, and Lyndon was a kind of like a convenience store owner in North Carolina, and he had just over the 10 years, he'd have managed to save about $107,000 in the bank. This is another reason why you shouldn't have your money all in the bank. Lyndon McClellan went to bed one night, this $107,000, and feeling pretty good because he didn't really have a lot of debt. He'd paid off most of his loans. His business was going okay. He had a lot of cash in the bank, and he liked what he did. And he woke up the next morning, and the money was all gone out of the bank. The IRS had seized all of his money because his pattern of deposits made it appear that he was structuring his deposits to stay under a $10,000 threshold, which you have to report your deposit. The bank, you don't do it. The bank reports your deposit so that they know that they want to make sure that you're not a criminal laundering drug money. Now, maybe Lyndon was a criminal laundering drug money. Maybe he wasn't. That isn't the point. The point is, he was never charged with any crime. They never even spoke that there was a crime. They just said that he was structuring his deposits to avoid this mandated banking regulation that had been imposed on our businesses and our banking by our government. Supposedly this was to stop drug kingpins from laundering money. Well, it obviously wasn't being structured. I mean, he would take withdrawals out so he'd make payroll, but he was mostly putting more in than he was taking out, and all of them were under that much money because, man, you have to have a pretty whopping business to be depositing $10,000 a day. Think of it, that would be like a $30 million a year business. I don't know anybody that's a sole proprietor business that has a business that's going like that. I mean, maybe if you're like a middle-sized corporation or something, that's like huge. Well, this is also related to why you don't want to have all your money in a bank. The banks are more and more. They're more and more regulated. They're more and more forced to follow regulations that don't really make sense, and they don't. They're not going to stop any real criminals. I mean, the banks are the biggest money launderers. HSBC, they got caught doing that, and they got a $2 billion fine, which is like a 2% of how much they make by laundering all that drug money, and they're still doing it because they're making a lot of money doing it, but no one worries about that actions. I mean, they found all sorts of ways to get around those reporting things that they have to do. They put extra periods between the letters so that they can, they put commas instead of decimal points for the numbers. They do all sorts of things to confuse the computers so that they don't understand what they're saying in their bookkeeping, and they appear to be able to continue to launder money. They've had one whistleblower that I've heard of came on and talked, and as far as I know, he's still living. But he was one of the people that had been hired to make sure they didn't continue to do money laundering. He was given no training, absolutely no training on what to look for and everything else. So he trained himself, and he realized, yes, they still were laundering money because he could tell they were, and he promptly got fired because he had discovered the secret that they were faking complying with the court order to police themselves. Well, I see the music's getting ready to start here, and gonna have to say night for tonight. See you next week. Check on your bank. Sorry. Night, buddy. Listen.
The walls sweat with nicotine and the temperature still to rise. So one more time with feeling you're bound to break. One more time.